My name is Eleanor Grayson. I'm 71 years old. Charleston was still heavy with summer that morning, the air thick with salt and the slow hum of cicadas. I drove downtown beneath the live oaks that shaded Broad Street, their branches meeting overhead like an old cathedral. A week had passed since Thomas's funeral, but the black dress still hung to my skin like a second grief. The law office sat in one of those narrow brick buildings that had survived hurricanes and centuries. Inside, everything smelled of paper and lemon polish. Claire was already there. Perfect posture, pale suit, no trace of mourning. She smiled when she saw me, the way a hostess does when an uninvited guest appears. Mr. Henderson, our attorney, cleared his throat and began reading. His voice was smooth, professional. To my daughter, Claire Grayson, I leave the family estate at Wentworth Avenue, along with all financial holdings and accounts, estimated at $6 million. Claire's eyes flicked toward me. She didn't gloat not yet, but her lips curved. Soft and sure, like someone confirming what she already knew. Mr. Henderson turned the page. To my wife, Eleanor Grayson, I leave the property known as Grayson Cabin, located on Lake Marion, including any surrounding acreage and contents therein. That was all. The words floated in the air for a moment, brittle as dried leaves. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap. Claire let out a tiny, theatrical sigh, then touched my wrist. Dad always said you loved that cabin. I'm sure you'll be comfortable there. Comfortable. The same word she'd used when I broke my hip last winter and refused to move into her guest room. Mr. Henderson looked at me carefully. Mrs. Grayson, your husband made these arrangements 3 months ago. He was very clear in his instructions. I nodded. My throat was too dry for words. When we stepped outside, the Charleston heat hit like a wall. The bells from St. Michael's tolled somewhere down the street. Claire walked beside me, clicking her heels on the cobblestones. At the corner, she leaned close, her voice low and almost kind. Even that cabin's more than you deserve, she said. She crossed the street before I could reply. I stood there a moment, watching her pale figure fade into the sunlight, then turned toward the parking lot. The air smelled of salt and magnolia. The world, somehow, had kept going. I started the car and drove home to pack. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Claire's car was already there, parked crookedly across the front walk like she owned the ground itself. 2 moving trucks idled beside the azaleas, engines low and impatient. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe just less kind. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint. Claire stood in the foyer, pointing at the wallpaper samples taped to the wall. We'll start with the living room, she told one of the movers, then turned to me with a bright, brittle smile. Oh, good you're here. I cleared out the guest room so you can finish packing. I went upstairs, taking the steps slowly. The photographs were gone from the hallway our family trips. Thomas in his fishing hat, Claire at her graduation. Bare hooks dotted the walls like scars. I found my suitcases in the corner of the bedroom, open and waiting. As I folded my clothes, the memories came in pieces. Claire as a toddler wobbling down this very hallway, her tiny hands clutching my fingers, her first prom dress hanging from that door, the day she left for college, promising to call every Sunday. I had believed those promises the way a mother always does, without proof, without reason. Downstairs, the movers thumped and shouted. Boxes disappeared out the front door. I heard Claire's laugh sharp, effortless. Be careful with that vase, she said. It's expensive. When I came down with my 2 suitcases, the new decorator was measuring the windows. She didn't even glance my way. I paused at the threshold of the living room, where sunlight fell across the polished floor. For a second, I could almost see Thomas standing there, smiling the way he used to when we first moved in, before everything softened and cracked with time. Claire walked over, crossing her arms. "Don't scratch the floor on your way out," she said lightly. I nodded once, too tired to speak. Then I stepped outside, the suitcases heavy in my hands, the air thick and hot against my face. The screen door creaked closed behind me. I didn't look back. The rain started halfway down Highway 52, thin at first, then steady, washing the dust off the windshield in slow gray strokes. The marshes stretched endlessly on either side, flat and silver, broken only by the occasional heron lifting into the air. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the silence in the car louder than the rain. The farther I went, the fewer houses I saw. Charleston faded behind me, replaced by stretches of pine forest and long, empty roads. The cabin waited somewhere near Lake Marion, a place Thomas had loved, though I hadn't been there in years. He used to say it calmed his mind, the way the water looked at sunset, still enough to mirror the sky. I thought of him as I drove the way his hands were always calloused from fixing things, the soft whistle he made when he measured wood. He built the porch of that cabin himself, plank by plank, refusing help. "A man's promise should hold its own weight," he'd said once, wiping the sweat from his forehead. When I finally turned onto the dirt road, the rain had eased to a mist. The trees leaned close on both sides, dripping quietly. The cabin appeared like an old photograph, smaller than memory. The paint peeled, the steps sagging. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust. The windows were clouded, and the floor creaked under my shoes. I set my suitcases down and stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I struck a match and lit a single candle on the counter. The flame wavered, casting soft gold across the room. In one of the cupboards, I found a mug cracked, stained from years of coffee. The words were faded, but still legible. "To my Eleanor, my compass." I ran my thumb over the letters, the ache in my chest deep and steady. The rain began again outside, soft against the roof, as if the world were trying to remember how to start over. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the air cool and sharp with pine. I opened the windows to let the cabin breathe again. Dust swirled through the sunlight like tiny ghosts. Every corner carried the scent of time-old wood, mildew, faint traces of Thomas's tobacco. I began to clean slowly, more to keep my hands busy than anything else. The broom scraped against the warped floorboards, stirring up years of silence. Near the fireplace hung a faded photograph of the lake at sunrise, the kind Thomas used to take with his old film camera. The frame tilted slightly, and when I straightened it, I noticed something odd. One plank behind it didn't sit flush with the wall. I pressed it gently. It gave way with a soft creak. Behind it was a narrow gap, barely wide enough for my hand. My fingers brushed against something dry and thin in envelope. It was yellowed with age, my name written across it in Thomas's handwriting. My heart caught. I hadn't seen his writing since the hospital discharge papers. Inside was a folded note and a small brass key attached with string. The paper crackled as I opened it. "Keep this safe. I left something for you where it can't be lost to lawyers or paperwork beneath it." Another line, in his familiar tone. "Love isn't loud. It hides in the quiet places." I turned the key over in my palm. The tag was stamped with 3 simple characters. Vault 112. The candle on the table flickered, its flame bending toward the draft. Outside, a loon called across the lake low, haunting, alive. I closed the envelope carefully and sat for a long time, the key warm against my skin, feeling something I hadn't in weeks, purpose. 2 days later, I found myself back in Charleston. The drive felt shorter this time, though my hands shook on the wheel. The brass key sat in the cup holder, glinting in the morning light as if it knew the way. Broad Street was alive with noise and motion, carriages rattling, tourists taking photos, the faint toll of church bells. I hadn't been downtown since the funeral. Walking into the old granite building of First Coastal Bank felt like stepping into another lifetime. Thomas had kept my name as joint custodian on the safe deposit records. The signature card was still valid. At the front desk, a young teller greeted me, but when I handed her the key marked Vault 112, she blinked and excused herself. Moments later, an older man in a navy vest appeared. "Mrs. Grayson," he asked gently. "I remember your husband. Mr. Thomas Grayson, always polite, always on time, came every few months, always alone." He led me down a quiet corridor lined with polished doors. My heart pounded louder than our footsteps. When he unlocked Vault 112, the heavy door swung open with a sigh. The air inside smelled faintly of metal and cedar. A small wooden box sat on the center shelf, sealed with a ribbon. My name was written across it. The banker smiled softly and left me in privacy. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. Inside were several envelopes, documents neatly folded, property deeds stamped and notarized, a few gold coins wrapped in cloth. On top lay a single letter, addressed for Eleanor. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably his firm, patient, a little crooked at the edges. "You gave your life to others. To me, to Claire, to strangers in need. This land is yours, the part no one can buy or take. Guard it, not for wealth, but for peace, love, always." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I pressed the letter to my chest, breathing in the faint scent of old paper and cedar oil. Outside the vault, sunlight streamed through the marble hall, warm and golden. I walked out slowly, holding the box close, feeling as if Thomas had just taken my hand again, steady, sure, and guiding me forward. The lawyer's office overlooked the harbor, the afternoon light shimmering across the water like broken glass. Mr. Reeves, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses, spread the papers across his desk. He adjusted them carefully, as though the truth itself needed alignment before it could be spoken. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, tapping one of the maps. "Your husband purchased this land privately almost 25 years ago under a separate trust. It was never included in the estate that went through probate. Thomas kept this trust under a separate registration number, private, fully funded, and never listed in the family's joint filings, so no one, not even Claire, knew it existed." I leaned closer. The map showed the shape of the lake, a blue oval surrounded by green acreage. The red lines stretched farther than I expected over hills, through woods, even across a portion of the Wentworth property. I pointed at the northern edge. "That's Claire's house," I said quietly. He nodded. "Technically, yes. The mansion sits on land owned by the Grayson Trust. When the boundaries were redrawn for zoning 20 years ago, Thomas never transferred the deeds attached to the trust. Legally, her house was built on leased soil, she just never realized it, which now transfers entirely to you." For a moment, I just stared at the paper, tracing the lines with my fingertip. The edges of the map blurred as my eyes filled with tears. Thomas had done this deliberately. He had seen further than I ever imagined. Mr. Reeves pushed forward a set of updated title documents. "All that remains is your signature." My hand didn't tremble as I picked up the pen. The scratch of ink against parchment sounded final and soft, like the closing of a door that would never open again. When I finished, he smiled faintly. "Congratulations, Mrs. Grayson. It seems you own quite a bit more than a cabin." I folded the papers neatly into my bag and thanked him. As I stepped outside, the wind from the harbor lifted my hair, and the sunlight caught the water just right, bright, untamed, endless. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt the ground beneath my feet truly belonged to me. Chapter 7. The Visit. It was near sunset when I heard the tires on the gravel road. The sound was sharp, hurried, out of place in the stillness. I stepped onto the porch just as Claire's black sedan came to a stop in front of the cabin. The door flew open before the engine even died. She marched toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick bright, but her face was pale with anger. "You can't take the ground under my house," she shouted. "This is insane. Mother, completely insane." I stayed by the porch rail, my hands folded. "I haven't taken anything," I said softly. "I'm just done giving." For a second, the words seemed to hang in the air, weightless and absolute. Claire blinked, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She wasn't used to hearing calm from me, only apology, hesitation, soft explanations that made her feel taller. "You don't understand," she cried, voice cracking. "The bank called this morning. They froze the refinancing. They said the land title isn't mine. When the surveyor sent me the updated parcel map, I saw the Grayson Trust listed under your name. They said the bank can't refinance on land the borrower doesn't own. I have 2 loans tied to that property." The color drained from her face as she gripped the porch post. "They're talking about foreclosure," she whispered, almost to herself. It's all falling apart." I looked at her, the sharp lines of her face, the tremor in her hands, and I saw not an enemy, but the girl who used to run barefoot through the marsh grass, laughing as her father called her name. Something in me ached, but it didn't bend. "I'm not here to ruin you," I said quietly. "Just to live on what's mine." Claire took a step back, then another. The anger slipped from her face, leaving something smaller: confusion, maybe fear. The lake wind lifted her hair. For the first time, she had nothing left to say. I turned toward the porch light and switched it on. The golden glow spilled across the dirt road, steady and unshaken. Spring came early that year. The air around the lake softened, and pale blossoms opened on the magnolia tree outside the porch. I spent my mornings tending the small garden near the steps. Nothing fancy, just herbs, tomatoes, and a few stubborn marigolds that had somehow survived the winter. Life moved quietly again, like an old song played softly enough to remember the words. One afternoon, as I brought in the mail, a single cream-colored envelope sat among the usual bills. My name was written across it in a familiar, deliberate hand. I stood by the window for a long while before opening it. The first line was short. "I'm sorry, Mom." The next one broke something open in my chest. I thought money meant love. I see now what it cost me. The letter went on. Shakier this time. The bank repossessed the house. I sold the jewelry, the car, everything. The papers called it a tragic fall from grace. I can't sleep knowing how I treated you. I'd trade every dollar I ever touched just to have dinner with you again. I read it twice. The ink smudged where her tears must have fallen. There was no anger left in her words. Only exhaustion, the kind that comes when pride finally burns out. I took the letter outside and sat beneath the magnolia tree. The petals had started to fall, white against the grass like pieces of folded paper. I read her words once more, then folded them neatly along the creases. Inside the cabin, on the mantel above the small fireplace, sat Thomas's old compass box. I lifted the lid and placed the letter inside. Beside the brass compass and the worn photograph of the 3 of us at the lake, back when everything still fit inside one picture, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of magnolia and rain. I closed the box gently and left it there, a quiet truce sealed not in words, but in stillness. A year passed, quiet and steady as the tide. The cabin no longer felt like exile It had become a home. The porch boards gleamed under fresh varnish, and the garden spread wider each season, full of herbs, wildflowers, and the laughter of women who came to rest here. Word had spread slowly, carried by neighbors and the church bulletin, a small retreat on Lake Marion for widows and single mothers in need of quiet. It wasn't grand, but it was steady. On weekends, the porch filled with soft voices and the smell of bread baking. I never charged a fee. Peace was the only currency I wanted. That evening, the sun dipped low over the lake, turning the water copper and gold. I sat outside with a teapot and 2 cups. Out of habit, more than hope, the porch light had just flickered on when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A car door closed, then footsteps hesitant, careful. I turned, and there she was, Claire. Her hair pulled back simply, a bouquet of lilies in her hand. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered. I nodded toward the empty chair. "You came a long way," I said. She sat, setting the flowers between us. The silence stretched, but it wasn't sharp anymore. After a moment, she reached for the teacup I'd poured without thinking. We drank in quiet rhythm, the air humming with crickets and the faint call of an owl across the lake. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "I didn't know how to fix it," she whispered. I placed my hand over hers, not to forgive, not to forget, just to meet her where she was. The porch light glowed over us, soft and golden. I thought of Thomas, of the years lost and the ones that remained. Some inherit houses, others inherit peace. I knew which one lasted.